They told me to shut down the pump by sundown, or the HOA would cut me off, fine me, and make this place worthless. Said it with a smile like they were doing me a favor. I remember the way Marjorie Vale adjusted her blazer, all soft steel and committee votes, and how the men behind her looked like they'd practiced anger in a mirror. I told them the pump wasn't going anywhere, and that answer changed everything. My name's Eli Mercer, and I grew up where the road turns to dust and the map forgets you. This place Cedar Run has been in my family long enough that the fence posts still lean the way my grandfather drove his plow. We work the land, we fix what breaks, and we drink water out of the same trough we always have. So when the HOA brand new, glossy letterhead, 10 people, and a lot of opinions decided they could tell me how to use the ground under my feet, it felt like someone trying to rent out my memories. Marjorie was the perfect antagonist, precise, practiced, with a legal pad full of rules nobody read until they needed them. She'd been elected by folks who liked to garden and complain, and equal measure people who wanted tidy hedges and zero fuss. Me, I'm not tidy. I'm a stubborn sort, and I do things the old way because the old way works. I had a right to the well, or at least that's what my great-grandfather's deed said. Faded ink, a margin note, a surveyor's stamp from a time when the county clerk still knew everyone's name. I kept those papers in a tin above the stove, where the cockroaches couldn't reach them, and the truth warmed every breakfast. The first act of this mess is small and loud. Marjorie shows up in the morning, a deputy's business card tucked in her folder, and demands compliance. She talks about covenants and community standards, like we're in a homeowners meeting and not a farm with a real cost for losing water. She says this is about safety, and means this is about control. I let her talk while the men from the drilling crew stared at me like I was the stranger in a family photograph. When she left, I found a notice stapled to my gate: cease operations, pending review. They thought they'd pause me. They hadn't counted on memory. Act 2 is where it stops being about rules and becomes about who remembers the truth. I called Marta Reyes, the woman 2 houses down whose dog knows every mule on my place. She grew up here too, knows the old easement lines, and when she came by she had a stack of her own old utility maps and a fading county ledger where Cedar Run had been spelled wrong in 3 places. We spent an afternoon in my kitchen, sunlight through the curtains, tracing letters and whispering like we were reading a secret. There's power in paperwork, especially the kind written before people decided to profit from neat rows of identical houses. The more we dug, the clearer it became. The HOA's authority was thin as a receipt, but my claim had depth: historical use, tacit permission, a clause that said public right-of-way, where the HOA insisted it saw private control. That discovery changed the rhythm. Marjorie escalated letters turned into certified parcels into a demand for a survey into a temporary injunction. They brought someone to the front gate with clipboard and camera, as though taking pictures would sterilize history. I remember the day the county inspector arrived, a man in a uniform too clean for our dust, sneakers that squeaked on gravel. He'd read the HOA's complaint and pronounced that something felt off. He didn't know the name my grandfather used for the creek, didn't know the pipe under the sycamore that my uncle sunk by hand. He took notes, left, and at night someone spray-painted "Save Our Trees" on the community mailbox. It felt petty and deliberate, like a gust of smoke meant to hide a much bigger fire. What surprised me and should have surprised me less was how quickly neighbors took sides. People I'd waved to for years began avoiding eye contact, like we were on opposite teams in a game they didn't understand. Some thought Marjorie was right. They liked the idea of order. Others saw her for what she was, someone who loved power without responsibility. The town had its coffee shop politics, whispered alliances, a petition here, a whispered rumor there. I started waking up to cars parked down the road, people taking pictures of the pump like it was a celebrity, and we were the paparazzi. The midpoint comes when my lawyer third cousin, once removed, but he knows how to read county ledgers, says, "Eli, you have a shot." He's a man who smells of coffee and practicality. He doesn't wear fury like a coat. He wears it like a work boot. We file for an injunction of our own, ask for a declaratory judgment, and in the meantime, Marjorie answers with procedural fire, threats of contempt, fines big enough to make a bank manager raise an eyebrow. There's a scene I keep replaying where she shows up a second time, not with measured words, but with a kind of moral thunder. "You're putting the whole community at risk," she says. like that sentence absolves her of curiosity. I tell her, calm as I can, that I'm not the villain, that I'm trying to keep a family alive. She smiles in a way that's almost proud and walks away, knowing people will see her as the reasonable one. Then escalation. The HOA hires a private surveyor to re-examine the boundaries and posts a notice that they'll be enforcing access to community infrastructure. That night, someone cut a padlock on the Valve House 2 properties down. No one claimed responsibility, but the timing was subpoena-like. The point is not that someone stole a key. The point is that fear costs more than money. The men who worked for me started looking at the pump like it was a grenade, nervous about whether next week the bank would show up with a notice or the county would post a for sale sign. I'd always thought fear would come with a showdown left hand and right hand thrown into the ring, but it came as paperwork and late-night whispers, and those cut deeper. Act 3 starts in a courtroom that smells faintly of old coffee and waxed floors, the kind of place where decisions are made by people who think they are being fair. We bring our papers, deeds, maps, affidavits from neighbors who remember the well before the HOA ever met. Marjorie brings her binder of covenants, neatly tabbed, as though the neatness will win the room. The judgy and older woman with a habit of folding her hands like she's closing a book listens. There's a moment when she asks me, plainly, why does this matter? And I tell her about the trough and the cattle and the sound of water at night. I tell her about the way land asks to be treated like a belonging, not a commodity, and for a second I see the room softening. But the lovely, inflexible law asks for text. We argue semantics. We debate notice periods. We talk about easements like chess pieces. And then we bring out the map. Not a modern printout, but an old, smudged county map with a surveyor's seal so old the ink looks like it belonged to another century. It shows a right-of-way, a dotted line that traces past my pump and snakes toward the public road like a thread. Marta testifies. She remembers the men who placed those markers, the sound of hammers, the smell of wet earth. A neighbor, Mr. Hargrove, who everyone thought too removed to care, produces a ledger entry from 1969, an attorney's note that says, use of water shall remain. It's not dramatic, not a smoking gun, but it's layered. The judge looks at the ink, looks at our faces, and then does the thing judges do. She balances scales. She rules that we can't be summarily shut down pending a deeper hearing. It's not a win, it's not a final permit, but it's enough to stop the immediate, suffocating momentum of the HOA. What follows is the unglamorous part of victory: repairs, outreach, the kind of neighbor work that involves more barbecues and fewer legal briefs. Marjorie, predictably, pivots. She starts a campaign about community standards and how the county will thank them for their vigilance. Some neighbors applaud her. Others avoid her like a weather front. She loses a few votes at the next board meeting. Humility, it seems, is a hard sell, and in the end, the HOA's tough talk is softened by a settlement that involves oversight, a written agreement, and most importantly, continued access to the pump under certain conditions. It's messy, like most things that involve people who want power and people who want to keep a place alive. But the most cinematic part isn't the courtroom. It's a small scene in the dusk after the judge's words. I walk the fence line with a flashlight and find the pipe my uncle installed years ago, bent, but intact. The cattle come up to the fence and breathe, and the sound of water is a relief I can put my hand on. That night, I sit on the tailgate and think about what justice looks like outside a courthouse. It looks like neighbors who used to be strangers bringing over tools, like someone fixing a broken gate at dawn, like a kid, no, not a kid, a man I used to see at church handing me a jar of peaches and saying, "You did good, Eli." Those small things matter. They are the stitches that hold the rest of the skin together. I'll be honest, nothing about this was tidy. We didn't overthrow a system or ride off on cinematic horses. The HOA didn't suddenly admit how wrong they'd been and host a bake sale to celebrate. But grievance has a way of sticking. I still see Marjorie at the grocery store, and she still thinks she was right. That's fine. The point wasn't to humiliate anyone. It was to hold a line. If there's a last frame to this story, it's not a closing argument, it's the pump humming at dawn, a thin sound like a promise. I keep my grandfather's deed in the tin above the stove, and sometimes, when the day is quiet, I take it out and read the margin notes, and think about roots and paperwork and the strange, fragile contract between people and land. This fight taught me that rights are only as real as the people willing to stand for them. and that sometimes the thing that looks like stubbornness is just love disguised as obstinance. So here's what I want to know from you: what counts as justice when your home is tied to a piece of paper and a memory? When the person who enforces the rules thinks rules are the same as fairness? Tell me where you stand. Is it right for a community to impose uniform standards when those standards risk erasing a way of life? Or is it right to expect everyone to play by the same rulebook for the good of the many? Drop your take in the comments. Tell a story if you've got one like mine. And if this struck a chord, share it with someone who lives where maps get thin. If you want to see more stories like this, small places, big fights, like and subscribe, and we'll keep telling these stubborn, messy, human stories together.